everybody. So this is episode 7, and I'm going to be talking about El Cacique, Guacanagari. And as a reminder to everybody, I'm doing these videos so us Dominicans born and raised outside of the island can better learn our history, our culture, and who we are as a people. Guacanagari was the main cacique for the Cacicasco of Marian. We know that the island was split into several cacicascos, and as we see here, we have Jaragua, Marian, Maguana, Magua, and Higüey. Here are the caciques of each cacicasco. So we have Boecio in Jaragua, Guarionex in Magua, Guacanagaris. So the correct way, the indigenous way to say it is Guacanagari, because the X was J back in the day. But he was the one for Marian. And then Caunabo was Maguana, and Cayacoa was Higüey. There was a cacica before Cayacoa, but she was unalived very quickly by the Spanish. I'm going to use the name that most people are familiar with, which is Guacanagari. And he was, as I've said, the cacique of Marian all the way in the upper northwest of the island. So it covered both this side of the island and parts of what today is the Dominican Republic. And it's important to understand that these people were not allied. They all could decide whatever they wanted in terms of allies, in terms of enemies. And we note that at the time of Colón's arrival, Caunabo and Guacanagari were enemies. Colón and Guacanagari met before he slammed La Santa Maria into the side of the island. It wasn't actually Colón who did it. It was a boy who was left at the steering of the ship, even though this was prohibited. The guy who was steering the ship got sleepy and decided, hey, I'll let a 14-year-old steer the ship. Guacanagari had actually been on Colón's boat before the crash, and it was on the boat that they decided to establish basically a treaty. Through his indigenous guides, which included El Indio Diego Colón, he was able to communicate to a certain extent with Guacanagari. He sealed a pact of supposed friendship and trade. When the Santa Maria crashed, Colón actually sent 2 people to find Guacanagari plus Al Indio Diego Colón. He sent Diego de Arana and Pedro Gutierrez to find him. And they came running. They came to help Colón empty the ship. But since it was still nighttime when this happened, he actually sent a good amount of his people to guard the ship and its contents during the entire night. Guacanagari allowed Colón to establish the first fortress or fortaleza in las Americas, Europea, and he even helped him build it. Colón, in exchange, promised to protect Guacanagari and his people from his enemies, including the Caribs. He left the entire fortress of La Navidad in the hands of Guacanagari and his people. And he warned his men to not venture further inland than where La Navidad was established. He also told them to not separate one from the other, but to stay within the fortress. But when Colón returned on his second trip, he couldn't find them. The fortress was gone. Colón was completely distraught. He had already felt guilty about leaving these 39 men. We now know that there were also women in this fortress, and to come back and see everything destroyed. And not only that, but to find several bodies around the location. Supposedly, he even cried. But he was also furious. He needed to find Guacanagari. He sent out El Indio Diego Colón with some men to find him. And they found him, but he was injured. He told these men that he had been injured fighting against the person who had destroyed La Navidad, Caunabo. And not only Caunabo had had allies. He had attacked with the help of another cacique, Beechu of Jaragua. In some accounts, I have also read that Caunabel's brother was also involved, and his name was Mariani. The men left to report back to Colon after receiving gifts of gold from Guacanagari. They let Colon know what Guacanagari had explained to them. And the next day, Guacanagari sent his own brother to invite Colon to come to his cane and see for himself. The ship's physician, El Doctor Chanca, writes, the admiral went ashore along with most of the leaders. And they found Guacanagari sitting in his hammock, surrounded by his wife and other ladies in waiting. They quickly noticed that he was also surrounded by guards. Chanca writes, he did not get up and showed deep emotion, to the point of tears for the Christian's death, and began talking about that, saying as best he could that a few had died of illness and others had gone into Caunabel's territory to find the gold mine in the city and were killed there, while the rest had been seized and killed in their own camp. Guacanagari then presented Colon with several gifts, including a crown made of solid gold. El Doctor Chanca went to examine Guacanagari, but he said he was faking it. He wasn't injured. He encouraged Colon to punish him because it was obvious that it was Guacanagari who had destroyed La Navidad. Hearing that his ally Guacanagari had been attacked and was hurt, Colon asked him to come meet him at his ship. He wanted to talk to him. And even though it was very clear that Guacanagari had pretended to be injured, Colon was won over by Guacanagari's tale. They restored their friendship and continued to be allies. After Guacanagari was examined by Chanca, the physician, Guacanagari was brought onto the ship and he was treated like royalty. He was given cakes and sweets, and he is the first documented cacique to actually see horses. It is said that he was both terrified, surprised, intrigued by these animals on board of Colon's ship. This here depicts how they transported the animals in the belly of the ship. While still on the boat, Colon used El Indio Diego Colon as an interpreter to have Guacanagari understand that he needed to establish a second settlement. Unknowingly, Guacanagari actually gave really important intel to Colon. And Colon started to learn about the different tribes and the different political alliances on the island. He would later use this information to put the indigenous populations against each other. He then allowed Guacanagari to return to his Yucayeque. Colon would later regret letting the cacique go. Guacanagari's brother then showed up the next morning with women from Borinquen. And this is a controversial anecdote or part of the story. A lot of people feel that this was just added to give the indigenous people a bad look, a bad reputation. However, we do know that this was a strategy used by the indigenous people. So he then proceeded to basically violate the women. Guacanagari's brother, not the Spanish. And it's said that he took his time with these women. And the desired effect was to kind of distract the Spanish while Guacanagari made his escape. Because for some reason not described, Guacanagari became fearful of Colon. It was probably his gut feeling said, hey, let's get out of here. It is then believed that these men basically took turns and spent the whole evening with these women. At some point, they all fell asleep. The indigenous girls actually leapt from the boat. So they jumped off the boat into the water. And since the Spanish and the indigenous men that had brought them to the boat were all sleeping, by the time the men woke up, the girls they were long gone. Pedro Martí de Angleria actually records this incident and says, they had covered such a long distance that our boats were not able to recapture but 4 of them when they were getting out of the water. Pedro Martí de Angleria is that Catalina, who seemed to have been the principal of this group of women, relying on the strength of her arms, swam about 3 miles in not so very calm a sea. Indeed, that was the distance of the ship from the shore. The Spanish then took a smaller boat and were able to capture 3 more of the women, but not Catalina. They believed that she actually ran after Guacanagari. They then went in search of Guacanagari and the women, and they found that he had escaped with all of his possessions. They searched all of the countryside that was nearby the shore, trying to find Guacanagari, and they captured several indigenous people and tried to get them to say where he was. But they all said the same thing. We don't know. We haven't seen him. Colón then decided to get back onto his boat with all of his men and continue along the shoreline. They ended up near what is today La Isabela. And it was in that spot where Colón established his second settlement in the Western Hemisphere. Antonio de Torres arrived at Cadiz, Spain on March 7th, 1494. He returned with 30,000 ducats worth of gold, which in today's money is about $7,700,000. He also returned with 26 indigenous people, but nobody cared about them. The gold was the main protagonist. Colón also sent a very detailed letter with Antonio de Torres asking for more supplies so that they could finally form this permanent settlement. It was during this exchange that the king and queen let Colón know that they were not interested in receiving more indigenous people. They just wanted the gold. They wanted the indigenous people to be converted to Catholicism while in their homeland. Please don't bring any more of them. Colón also complained in his letter that the gentlemen that were being sent over were worthless. They didn't work. And this was what caused the problem of labor. The Spanish who were being brought over, they came from all walks of life. Some were criminals, some were rich, some were middle class, etc. But they felt that they didn't need to work. They didn't need to do anything in order to achieve the riches that were promised to them. So the indigenous slave labor became something invaluable. It was needed in order to get more gold. Back on the island, Colón was still very ill during this time, so he assigned his brother, Don Diego Colón, to basically supervise and oversee the construction of La Isabela. He had sent out Alonso de Ojeda and 15 men to look for the gold mines of El Cibao. They came back a few days later saying, "We found them. Let's go." So on March 12, 1494, Columbus himself led a group of every able-bodied man he had in the fortress out into the mines of El Cibao. Once on the hilltop where he was close enough to the gold mines, Colón decided, you know what, we need another fortress in order to keep the men safe as they mined for gold. This fortress was called San Tomás. He had already begun a system where if the indigenous people brought him gold or food or supplies, he would give them like little trinkets, like little bells, little glass beads, etc. So when he established the fort of San Tomás, he basically spread this system out. And this was the start of the tribute system of the West Indies. On April 1st, Colón returned to La Isabela to find that the men he left there had rebelled. Bernal Díaz de Pisa was their leader, and Colón proceeded to immediately arrest him. He then wrote several letters to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, explaining why he had to punish several of the settlers that had rebelled against him. By this time, Colón was dealing with several different groups of people. He had left people in La Isabela to continue constructing. He had also left people in La Fortaleza de San Tomás in El Cibao to continue looking for gold. There, they had been attacked by indigenous people who were not allied with Guacanagari. He was also dealing with several mutineers or rebels of his own crewmen. And he also was awaiting back the return of the group that had left for Spain with Antonio de Torres. It is believed that during this time, for the most part, Colon and his men were still sleeping at night on the ships, fearing that the Tainos would unalive them. Without the help of Guacanagari, everybody was starving. Because of the heat, the humidity, they didn't know how to harvest any food, anything that would sustain them in the long run. Colon tried to establish a wheat grinding mill where they would grind wheat in order to get flour to produce bread. But the bread would become moldy, and then they would all fall ill. The constant state of starvation produced many illnesses and also produced a very violent reaction from Colon himself. He was always threatening violence against the settlers. He used this tactic to continue to retain control over the settlement, over La Isabela, but it was failing fast. When he felt that the end was probably very near, all of a sudden a messenger from La Fortaleza de San Tomás appeared. He came running. He was frantic, bearing horrible news. He said that the indigenous people that lived around La Fortaleza de San Tomás, they were all abandoning their yucayeques. They were all leaving. And the reason was that Caunabo, Guacanagari's enemy, had sent messengers saying that he was going to unalive all the Christians in the area. Colon reacted quickly. He gathered about 70 men, and he also put Alonso de Ojeda as a commander-in-chief. However, soon the power that this young man was given just went into his head and created a very dangerous situation. It became clear that Ojeda was hot-headed, and he was quick to draw first blood. They were able to go to La Fortaleza de San Tomás and calm the situation, but it wasn't over. It was just starting. On April 9th, 1494, Alonso de Ojeda left La Isabela with 400 men. On April 9th, 1494, Alonso de Ojeda left La Isabela with 400 men. Colon himself then reports what happens. He writes, "There were over 2,000 Indians, all armed with javelins, which they launched from slings much more quickly than from a bow. And all of them were painted black and other colors with fancy glass beads, mirrors, masks, hairs of copper and gold on their heads, letting out frightening screams as they do at certain times. One group had planned to wait on the field for the horses and tip them over by jumping on them. They tried to carry out their plan, but it was the horses that ran over them as they stood in their way, and the horses collided with them and killed them." It is believed that this, in San Tomás de Jánico, is where this actually happened. Because the Tainos concentrated on attacking the horses and inadvertently ended up unaliving themselves, they lost the battle. And Columbus considered this a miracle. He was so excited. He was like, yes, God is on our side. And he writes, "It is a miracle of no small importance that a few Christians could escape a multitude of people sworn to their death." Ojeda himself was able to capture 3 important people. It says that he was able to capture un cacique, the brother of the cacique, and his nephew. They don't write down who these people were, though, so we don't have an actual idea of what cacique this was. We just know that he placed them in chains and he brought them to Columbus, who was actually back at La Isabela because he didn't actually accompany him to this battle. Ojeda was cruel enough to have one of the prisoners sent back to the nearest village and had one of his men cut off his ears. He took the other prisoners back to La Isabela, where Colon was at. Columbus was so upset at having to deal with them that he actually ordered for these prisoners to be taken into the public square in La Isabela and beheaded. No longer were the Christians just seen as a nuisance that was invading. they were a real threat. Las Casas takes this event as proof that the indigenous people had a right to defend themselves. But Columbus's main concern was to continue exploring. Remember, he thought he was still in Asia and that he hadn't found the mainland yet. So he left La Isabela in hands of his brother, Don Diego Colon. He also left basically a council in place with Diego. And the council was made up of Fray Buil, Pedro Fernández Coronel, Alonso Sánchez de Carvajal, and Juan de Lujan. Colon set sail on a Thursday, April 24th, 1494. He took 3 ships with him and headed to Montecristi. Next day, he entered into a nearby harbor and he expected to find Guacanagari because remember, he had forgiven him. They were supposedly still allies. But when Guacanagari saw the ships in the harbor, he fled. Colon sent his men out to see what happened, and Guacanagari's people said, "Oh no, don't worry, he'll come back." So Colon waited, but by Saturday, he's not coming back. So he decided to continue his traveling and headed for Tortuga. The next couple of months was him just traveling around Cuba, trying to figure out if it was the mainland or if it was an island. He was gone for approximately 3 months. But again, on this trip, he fell severely ill and he even went blind. His crew became scared because he could no longer direct them. But with the help of the Indian guides, they were able to turn back around and head towards La Isabela. They arrived back at the fort of Isabela on September 29th, 1494. Colon was so weak from exhaustion, malnutrition, that he ended up having to be carried into the fort. And he would continue to be sick until the next year in February, around February 1495. For reasons that we don't know, Guacanagari decided to reach out to Colon after hearing that he had come back from his trip. He wanted to again let Colon know that he had nothing to do with what happened with the people at La Navidad. He didn't encourage any cacique to slaughter them. He explained here in La Isabela that because of his ally status with Colon, these other caciques, again, Caunabo and Beecho, decided to take him on as an even greater enemy. Beecho had actually killed one of his wives, and Caunabo had stolen another. So he now asked Colon to please reunite and help him to gain revenge against these 2 caciques. So we could probably assume that the reason he showed up was because this had happened to him during the time that Colon was away. Colon also writes and says that Guacanagari wept each time he recalled the men who had been killed at La Navidad, as if they had been his own sons. Colon, along with his brother Bartholomew and Guacanagari, devised a plan to get revenge against Caunabo and Beecho. So by March, Colon felt recovered enough to get this plan into motion. The allies marched from La Isabela on March 24th, 1495. Here the details are kind of sketchy because it said that Columbus and Guacanagari jointly were commanding around 200 Spanish guards, 20 horses, and about 20 hounds or dogs. However, it doesn't mention how many of Guacanagari's men accompanied them. What is described is the following. They were supposedly fighting more than 100,000 Indians. We need to take that with a grain of salt because we know that most of the time they exaggerated the numbers in order to make these battles seem more impressive. Their plan consisted on dividing their group. They decided to split and come around and force the indigenous people in the middle. A similar move as what the Caribs did to the Ciguayos in la Península de Samaná. Colon believed that because the Tainos were very skittish, that by hearing noises in multiple sides, because they used their arquebuses, they used their hounds, they used their horses, they made lots of noise, that the indigenous people would panic and run in all directions. And it worked. Some were unalived by shots, others by the dogs, others by being trampled by the horses. And among the fighters was the one that they were seeking out the most, which was Caunabo. Caunabo was not on his own. We know that Beecho was also present, who was his brother-in-law. because Becho's sister was Ana Caona. Reasons unknown, Becho abandoned Caunabo and he was captured along with his wives and children. So where was Guacanagari? This sly man right here slipped away and he never was allied to Colon again. It is believed that this is exactly what Guacanagari wanted. He wanted Caunabo to be captured because Caunabo was just laying waste to his own Yucayeque and his own people. Because remember, they were not allies per se in between them. They were all independent nations that basically just consisted of a town. This battle is known as La Batalla del Santo Cerro. Because the details weren't written immediately, we have different details from different areas. Some say that Guacanagari was actually already in La Vega Real waiting for Colon, and others say that he met with Colon in La Isabela and headed out. It is supported right now, the idea that Colon headed out. He did not wait for Guacanagari. He actually went towards El Santo Cerro on his own, and Guacanagari stayed there waiting for him. We assume that he probably sent some sort of messenger to let him know to not come to La Isabela, but to stay there. This battle didn't last more than a few minutes. However, this changed the course of power on the island and allowed the Spanish to completely overtake it. It doesn't mean that the indigenous people didn't continue to fight back. They continued to do so as long as they could. The men who were killed in this battle were eventually brought back to La Isabela and buried. You can actually see these burials in El Museo de la Isabela in Puerto Plata. It is known, though, that Guacanagari was never captured by the Spanish. However, it is believed that El Cacique Guarionex did capture him, and he actually disemboweled him and let him die tied to a tree. What we know for certain is that Guacanagari was a strategist. He went with whoever he thought could be his best ally at the moment. If he needed to betray you because you no longer were worth his time, he would do it. The last thing that we know about Guacanagari is that it was reported that he had switched sides again and he was massacring by the dozens isolated Spanish settlers. Guacanagari and Caunabo were mortal enemies. And unfortunately, Guacanagari's determination to get rid of Caunabo brought the destruction of the entire island.